Let me tell you something about the Velthari. They've been warlords for 600 years. 600 years of conquest, of burned planets, of species that no longer exist because the Velthari decided they were in the way. They have a word in their language, Kithrava, and the closest translation in standard is acceptable losses. Except they use it for everything. Colonists who didn't evacuate fast enough. Fishing villages on moons they wanted to strip mine. Hospital ships that flew the wrong color. Acceptable losses. That's who they were before the Meridian Station incident. Before the child. I was stationed at Meridian 7 as a civilian logistics coordinator for the Terran Merchant Alliance. I'm not military. I want to be clear about that because some of the accounts that came out afterward painted everyone in a certain light. And I need you to understand that what I saw as an ordinary person standing in an ordinary corridor, holding a cargo manifest, watching a Tuesday become the day, the Galactic Council changed its entire security classification for a species that most of them had barely registered as significant. That species was us. That Tuesday was the last normal day the Velthari ever had. Section II Setup. Meridian 7 is a transit hub. That's the simplest way to describe it. It sits at the junction of three major trade corridors in what the navigational charts call the Outer Kessel Band, which sounds more dramatic than it is. It's a waypoint, a rest stop, a place where cargo ships refuel, where diplomats change transports, where merchants argue about tariffs in 40 different languages while eating food from 50 different worlds. It smells like recycled air and grease, and something the Korathi vendors sell from their carts that's technically a protein but looks like orange foam. The station itself is enormous, about 4 kilometers stem to stern, with 6 docking rings, an internal transit system that breaks down every third rotation, and a security force that's equal parts Terran, Aldrani, and Voss. It was built 60 years ago as a joint project, which is why it looks like 3 different architectural philosophies had an argument and nobody won. One section is all smooth curves and bioluminescent panels. Another is raw steel girders and industrial lighting. The human section, sections C through F, looks like someone took a mid-range airport from 2080 and tried to scale it up by a factor of 20. I worked in Section D, Level 3, Freight Coordination. My job was essentially making sure that the right cargo ended up in the right bay at the right time, which sounds simple until you're dealing with 16 species who have different definitions of right, cargo, bay, and especially time. The day it happened was a rotation Tuesday by Terran reckoning. Third shift had just handed over to first. The station was at roughly 60% capacity, not empty, not full, a normal operational day. There were maybe 300 people in the main concourse at any given moment. Traders. Travelers. A school group from the Aldrani home colony who were on some kind of cultural exchange. About 40 kids in matching green tunics, herded by 4 exhausted-looking adults. And there was Nora. I didn't know her name then. I learned it later. I learned a lot of things later that I couldn't have possibly known in the moment, standing there with my manifest, watching the concourse the way you do when you're not really watching anything, just letting the noise wash over you while your brain does its spreadsheet thing. Nara was 8 years old. She was sitting on a bench near the central fountain. Meridian 7 has a fountain, a real water fountain, which is either a remarkable luxury or an insane waste depending on your species, and she was eating something. A snack bar, I think. One of those compressed nutrient blocks that taste like nothing in particular but come in wrappers with cartoon animals on them. She had her feet dangling because the bench was too tall for her legs to reach the floor. She was wearing a yellow jacket, Terran issue, the kind with the reflective strip on the collar. Her father was 20 feet away, talking to a refueling agent at one of the service desks. He was turned sideways. Not ignoring her, just doing the thing parents do where they keep their kid in peripheral vision while handling something that needs 2 hands and a signature. Nora was just sitting there, eating her snack bar, watching the fountain. And that's when the Velthari walked in. Section III, the VELTHARI delegation. Now I need to describe the Velthari, because if you've never encountered them and you're hearing this account secondhand, the physical reality matters. The Velthari are large. That's the first thing. They average about 2.4 meters standing, with a forward lean to their posture that makes them look like they're always about to charge something. Their skin, if you want to call it that, is a dark, chitinous gray-blue that absorbs light in a way that makes them slightly difficult to look at directly, like they exist in their own shadow. They have 4 upper limbs, 2 primary arms that are heavy and articulated at multiple joints, and 2 secondary arms closer to their torso that are smaller but apparently quite precise. Their heads are elongated, with sensory clusters where you'd expect eyes and ears, though they process electromagnetic frequencies that human senses don't register. They dress in a specific way that makes their rank immediately legible to other Velthari, and once you learn to read it, to anyone else. Warlord class wear dark iron-colored armor with copper threading in specific patterns. Soldier class wear black with silver trim. The delegation that walked into Meridian 7's main concourse that Tuesday consisted of 8 soldiers and 1 individual who was clearly something else. He was wearing iron and copper, yes, but also a deep red sash from shoulder to hip, which I later learned signified a sub-warlord rank, the equivalent of a regional commander. His name was Vethkaron. I didn't know that then either. I learned it in the debrief. But I saw him walk in and I felt the shift in the concourse the way you feel weather change, not one specific thing, just a slight lowering of temperature, a collective recalibration of everyone's awareness. The Velthari weren't unusual visitors to Meridian 7. They had trade interests in the corridor, and while they weren't exactly beloved by the other species who used the station, they were tolerated in the way that powerful, unpredictable entities are always tolerated, carefully, with maximum personal distance. The thing was, Vethkaron walked in like he was doing an inspection, not like a traveler arriving at a transit hub. More like someone who owned the building and had come to check that the furniture was arranged to his satisfaction. His soldiers fanned out behind him in a formation that was technically not aggressive. They weren't drawing weapons. They weren't adopting combat stances, but it was the kind of not aggressive that takes up space. That makes people unconsciously step back. The Aldrani school group stepped back. Several merchants stepped back. The Korathi vendor started quietly relocating his cart toward a side corridor. I stepped back, and Nora didn't move, because Nora was 8 years old and she was watching the fountain and eating her snack bar, and had probably not yet learned the specific social vocabulary that says big intimidating thing is walking through the space you're sitting in. Adjust accordingly. Section IV, THE incident. What happened next took maybe 45 seconds. I want to be precise about the timeline because there's been a lot of embellishment in the accounts that circulated afterward, and I think the truth is actually more important than the embellishments because the truth is bad enough. Vethkaron was walking toward the central service corridor. There's an exclusive diplomatic transit lane on Meridian 7 that bypasses the main concourse and leads to the premium docking ring. He had the access codes. His delegation had been cleared. His path, if he kept walking straight, would take him past the fountain, past the bench where Nora was sitting. He didn't change his path. His secondary arm, the smaller one, lower on his torso, made contact with Nora's shoulder as he passed. Not a collision, not an accident. The motion was deliberate in the way that you can only recognize as deliberate when you've seen it before or when you watch the security footage about 60 times the way I later did. It was the motion of something being casually moved out of the way. Not violent, not even particularly forceful. The way you might brush a piece of paper off a table you need to set something on. But Nora was 8 years old and weighed maybe 25 kilograms, and the Velthari's secondary arm hit her at approximately shoulder height, and the bench was high, and she was small, and the physics of it. She went off the bench. She hit the floor. The snack bar skittered across the tile and disappeared under the fountain's base. Nora sat on the floor for maybe 1 second, and then she started to cry. Not screaming, just crying. The surprised kind, the kind that comes from the shock of suddenly being on the floor when you were just on a bench, and from the impact, and maybe from the fact that your snack bar was gone. Vethcaron didn't stop walking. His soldiers didn't stop walking. The concourse went absolutely silent in that way that spaces do, when something has happened that everyone present recognizes as wrong, but that is somehow also too large and too strange to react to immediately. Nora's father turned around. He saw his daughter on the floor. He saw the retreating figures of the Velthari delegation. And in that silence, in that fractional moment of collective breath-holding, I saw Nora's father's face do something that I have never been able to fully describe and have tried to describe about 100 times since. It went through grief and rage and calculation, and this is the part I keep coming back to, a kind of absolute stillness. Not calm, something harder than calm. The way a material gets harder when it's compressed past a certain point. He crossed to Nora in 4 steps. He knelt. He checked her hands, her elbows, her head. He was speaking to her, but I couldn't hear the words. She was still crying. He was systematic about it, head to toe, checking each contact point, a parent's kind of triage. Then he stood up, and he looked at the direction the Velthari had gone. Section V, Commander Reed. His name, I learned, was Commander Marcus Reed. I did not know this when I watched him stand up from checking his daughter's injuries on the floor of Meridian 7's main concourse. I just knew that he was a father, and that his daughter had been knocked off a bench, and that whoever had done it had walked away without so much as a pause. I learned later that Marcus Reed was, at that moment, on a personal leave of absence from the Terran Unified Defense Force, specifically from the TUDF's 9th Strategic Response Division. I learned that he held the rank of full commander, not the naval equivalent, the ground forces rank, which is a distinction that matters in certain very specific contexts. I learned that he had 17 years of active service, 3 conflict citations, and a commendation from the Interspecies Defense Accord for actions taken during the Korathi border incident 4 years prior, the details of which are still partially classified. I did not know any of this when I watched him stand up. What I knew was that he was wearing civilian clothes, gray jacket, dark pants, the kind of outfit that says I'm traveling and I didn't want to think about what to wear. He had no visible rank insignia, no weapons that I could see. He looked from a distance like exactly what he appeared to be, a man on a family trip, now standing in a station concourse, watching the back of a Velthari delegation that had just knocked his child to the floor. He spoke to one of the Aldrani school group's adult chaperones. A quick exchange. I saw him gesture toward Nora, and the chaperone nodded and moved toward her. He was arranging for his daughter to be watched. I absorbed this detail and didn't fully process what it implied until later. Then Marcus Reed followed the Velthari into the diplomatic transit corridor. Section VI, the corridor. Here's the thing about the diplomatic transit corridor on Meridian 7. It's not a public space. Access is coded. There are 2 security checkpoints, both of which are staffed by Aldrani security officers who are, in my experience, deeply professional and deeply unhappy about their job and determined not to let either of those qualities show. The corridor itself is about 300 meters long, well lit, climate controlled at a fixed neutral setting that's supposedly comfortable for the widest range of species, and monitored by a security system that captures everything in 3-dimensional audiovisual and stores it for 90 days. Marcus Reed did not have access codes for the diplomatic transit corridor. He didn't need them. This is where the accounts diverge based on who's telling the story. So let me tell you what the security footage, which I was later shown during a TMA incident review, actually showed. Reed approached the first checkpoint. The Aldrani officer there, a woman named Fiend, I think, though I might be misremembering the name, started to tell him that the corridor was restricted. Reed showed her something on a small personal device. A code, an identification, something. The footage doesn't capture what it was. Fiend looked at it. She looked at Reed. She stepped aside. She stepped aside in the way that implies whoever showed her the identification was not, in fact, a civilian wearing a gray travel jacket. Reed walked through. The second checkpoint officer apparently got a communication from the first and was already stepping aside by the time Reed reached him. Whatever Reed had shown them, it was enough. Section VII, what happened in the corridor? The Velthari delegation was approximately 60 meters into the corridor when Reed entered behind them. He didn't run. I want to emphasize that. Every account I've heard that dramatizes this moment has Reed running, sprinting, some of them, and that's not what happened. He walked. A specific kind of walking that I've since learned has a name in tactical training contexts: purposeful controlled approach. It's designed to close distance without triggering the threat response that a run would generate. And it's also just deeply unnerving to watch when you understand what it means. Vethkaron's soldiers noticed him at roughly the 40-meter mark. Two of them rotated to face the corridor behind them, standard rearguard positioning, no weapons drawn yet. They said something. I assume it was a warning in Velthari because Reed's pace didn't change. At 30 meters, one of the soldiers drew a weapon. Not a full deployment, a partial extension, the Velthari equivalent of a warning gesture. Reed stopped walking. He said something. The audio on the security footage is good enough to capture that he spoke, not loud, not shouting. The measured volume of someone who is accustomed to speaking in environments where they need to be heard precisely. The translation came out in the incident debrief as: Sub-Warlord Vethkaron, you struck my child. This is not a request for negotiation. This is formal notification that you have created a diplomatic incident. I am Commander Marcus Reed, TUDF 9th Strategic Response Division, and I am informing you that this incident is now being logged under the Terran Galactic Conduct Accord, Article 14, which covers unprovoked physical contact with noncombatants. You have 20 seconds to provide your delegation's formal identification for the record before I invoke emergency escalation protocols. The translation software later flagged that formal notification, in context, carries a specific legal weight under Galactic Council interspecies conduct law that most people don't know about. Essentially, what Reed did was the equivalent of serving legal papers in the middle of a corridor, except that these particular legal papers, once served and logged, automatically triggered a review process at the Galactic Council level. He wasn't threatening Vethkaron. He was telling him, precisely, and with full knowledge of the implications, that the next 20 seconds would determine whether this became a council matter. Vethkaron turned around. Section VII, the Sub-Warlord's response. I've talked to people who have studied the Velthari for years, and they told me something afterward that helped me understand what happened next. The Velthari, culturally, do not have a concept that translates cleanly as accountability. They have concepts around strength, around hierarchy, around the cost of weakness. What they understand is consequence administered by a superior force. What they do not understand, what they genuinely cannot map onto their social framework, is the idea that an inferior could have legitimate standing to demand accountability from a superior. In Velthari terms, Marcus Reed, alone, unarmed, smaller than average for his species individual in civilian clothes, did not have the standing to make demands of a sub-warlord, not because of any malice, but because the category didn't exist in their framework. You don't have standing because you have status, and status comes from force, and Reed was standing in a corridor by himself with no visible weapons. Veth Caron's response reflected this framework. He walked toward Reed. He spoke. The translation later was essentially, "You are nothing. Remove yourself before this becomes a different kind of incident." His soldiers fanned out behind him. Reed stood still. And then Reed said something that nobody in that corridor was prepared for, and that the two checkpoint officers, who had apparently moved close enough to hear, would later describe as the moment they realized this situation had already moved several steps past where they thought it was. Reed said, "The log is already running. Galactic Council Emergency Notification Protocol 7. You have 16 seconds remaining." He held up his personal device. There was a countdown on the screen. Not theatrical, he didn't hold it up for dramatic effect. He held it up because he was showing Veth Caron the active transmission status, the kind of functional demonstration you make when you want someone to understand that a thing is actually happening and not merely being threatened. Veth Caron looked at the device. Reed said 12 seconds. Section IX, the longest 12 seconds. I want to try to describe what the next 12 seconds felt like from the accounts of the people who were there, because I wasn't in that corridor, and the footage doesn't fully capture the atmosphere in the way that human memory does. The checkpoint officers both said the same thing independently. They'd never heard silence like that on the station. The ambient sound of Meridian 7, the ventilation, the distant traffic of the concourse, the low hum of the transit systems was all still there, but somehow it wasn't registering. Like the corridor had developed its own acoustic field, where the only things that existed were Reed standing still, and the countdown on the device, and 8 Velthari soldiers and their sub-warlord looking at each other across 30 meters of neutral temperature, well-lit diplomatic transit space. One soldier moved toward Reed. Reed said, without looking at the soldier, without changing his posture or his volume, "If you touch me, your warlord goes in front of the full council session, not just the emergency panel." 8 seconds. The soldier stopped. Not because Reed had threatened him. Because Reed had informed him of a specific escalation in consequence, and even if the soldier didn't know the council procedures intimately, something in the precision of the statement, the specificity of full council session versus emergency panel, suggested that this individual had access to real knowledge of real systems. The countdown reached 0. Reed lowered the device. He said, "The notification has been sent. Sub-Warlord Veth Caron's delegation ID, your trajectory data from entry through the incident, security footage timestamp, medical status of the affected non-combatant, and my formal statement are now with the Galactic Council Emergency Response Office. This is no longer a station-level matter." There was a pause. Then Reed said one more thing. And this is the part that got quoted everywhere afterward, that appeared in the council chambers, that was cited in diplomatic memos and military briefings for the next 2 years. "You thought she was acceptable loss. She's 8 years old and she's eating a snack bar and she's not acceptable anything. She's a child, and you're going to find out what that means." Then he turned around and walked back the way he'd come. Section X after. The checkpoint officers reported that Veth Caron stood in the corridor for approximately 90 seconds without speaking or moving after Reed left. I was back in the main concourse by then. I'd moved closer to where Nora was sitting. The Aldrani chaperone had settled her on a different bench, one of the lower ones, and someone had apparently found another snack bar from somewhere because she was eating again. She had a scrape on her palm that someone had put a small bandage on. She looked, I'm trying to remember this accurately, she looked fine. A little subdued, maybe. The way kids look after they've cried and the world has kept going normally around them. Reed came back into the concourse about 4 minutes after he'd left. He sat down next to Nora. I watched him talk to her. I couldn't hear anything. He was looking at her the way parents look at children they've just checked are all right, that particular combination of relief and residual anxiety that never quite fully resolves. She said something, and he nodded. She said something else, and he almost smiled. The station around them had slowly, gradually, begun to return to its normal sound level. Not immediately. These things take time. There was still a watchfulness to the concourse, that particular quality of a crowd that has witnessed something and doesn't know whether it's over yet. 37 minutes later, Veth Caron's delegation departed Meridian 7. Not quietly, there was a formal departure log, properly filed. But without the engagement with station leadership that a Velthari sub-warlord of his rank would normally conduct, they left like they needed to leave, like they had communications to make. I later learned that those communications went, in part, to the Velthari High Warlord Council on their homeworld, and that the Velthari High Warlord Council spent approximately 3 hours trying to understand what, exactly, Galactic Council Emergency Notification Protocol 7 was, and what it meant that it had been invoked against them. Section XI, what Protocol 7 actually is. I'm going to explain this because it mattered enormously, and most people don't know the specifics. And the specifics are the thing that made everything that followed inevitable. The Galactic Council has, as part of its foundational charter, a set of emergency notification protocols that were established after the Heron incident about 200 years ago, when an Aldrani diplomatic mission was attacked in transit, and the Council's response mechanism was too slow and too procedurally entangled to do anything useful before the situation had already resolved itself badly. Most of these protocols deal with things like armed conflict declarations, territorial disputes, and resource claim emergencies. Protocol 7 is different. Protocol 7 was added to the Charter 60 years ago, largely at the insistence of the smaller species coalitions, who argued, correctly, that the Council's existing mechanisms were designed around conflicts between large, militarily significant parties, and had no real teeth when it came to protecting individuals or small groups from actions by larger powers that fell short of full armed conflict. Protocol 7 covers what the Charter defines as unprovoked physical acts against non-combatant individuals of a recognized species, occurring in neutral jurisdictional space, committed by or under the direction of a recognized state actor. In other words, if you're a government or government-aligned entity and you're in neutral space, and you put your hands on a civilian who isn't fighting you, a formal complaint can be filed directly with the Council Emergency Panel, bypassing the usual procedural queues that can take months, and the matter goes to a hearing within 10 standard rotation days. The person who files the complaint needs to have either legal standing under the affected species framework or official representative capacity. Marcus Reed was a commander in the Terran Unified Defense Force. He was on personal leave, yes, but TUDF personnel never fully relinquish official standing. The moment he identified himself with his rank and invoked the protocol, he had standing. And because he'd pre-configured the notification to go out on a timer, which meant it wasn't submitted in anger, it was submitted with the precision of someone who'd thought carefully about the legal architecture involved. It was practically airtight. The Galactic Council Emergency Panel received the notification 22 minutes after it was sent. They issued an acknowledgement and formal case number within 90 minutes. They scheduled a hearing for 9 days out. And they sent a notification to the Velthari High Warlord Council that Sub-Warlord Veth Caron was expected to appear before the panel, with his delegation's record, to answer questions about the incident. Section XII, the reaction. The Galactic Council's scheduling notification landed in the Velthari diplomatic channels like a stone into still water. Not with a splash. Velthari leadership doesn't splash. It sinks, it spreads, and then everything around it shifts in ways that aren't always immediately visible. The initial internal Velthari assessment, based on what leaked into general circulation afterward, was apparently that this was a procedural nuisance. The Velthari had dealt with council complaints before. They were usually slow, usually inconclusive, and usually resolved without meaningful consequence. The Velthari High Warlord Council was enormous in territorial and military terms, and large military powers have historically discovered that being large and military provides a certain insulation from procedural accountability. They also, apparently, did not initially understand that the emergency panel hearing would be public record. This was the miscalculation. By the time the Velthari diplomatic team had fully assessed the situation, roughly 16 hours after the notification was sent, the incident record from Meridian 7 had been transmitted to the Council's Public Records Archive, as required by Protocol 7's transparency provisions. The record included the security footage, not the diplomatic corridor footage that was properly restricted pending the hearing, but the main concourse footage, which was station property, and which the TMA had released through its own transparency mechanisms because, frankly, someone in TMA leadership understood the optics and made a judgment call. The footage showed the main concourse. It showed the Velthari delegation walking through. It showed, in high-resolution three-dimensional capture, the moment Veth Caron's secondary arm made contact with Nora's shoulder. It showed her falling. It showed her on the floor. It showed Veth Caron not stopping. It showed her crying. And it showed her snack bar under the fountain. I don't know who made the decision to release that footage. I've been told it went through 3 levels of authorization before it went out. I know that within 48 hours of release, it had been viewed something on the order of 400 million times across species-shared networks, which, in galactic information sharing terms, is a number that means it had penetrated not just human systems but Aldrani networks, Korathi exchanges, Voss diplomatic feeds, and about 20 other species information ecosystems. And the reaction was not complicated. There's a thing that crosses species boundaries, not universally, not for every species, but for enough of them. A response to the image of a child who has been harmed and the entity that harmed them walking away without concern. Humans feel it. Aldrani, who raise their young in communal groups, feel it intensely. The Korathi, who are small themselves, feel something adjacent to it. The Voss, who are cold by most other species definitions, have a legal concept called Tharvan that roughly covers the protection of the vulnerable from the powerful, and the footage activated something in that framework. By the time 9 days had passed and the hearing was scheduled to begin, there were 14 species with formally filed observer requests to attend. Section XIII the night before. I went home back to my quarters in Section E, the evening of the incident, and I sat on my bunk for a while without doing anything. I kept thinking about the snack bar. I know that sounds like a strange thing to fix on. There was a lot that happened that day, but the snack bar under the fountain kept coming back to me, the way it had slid under there, the way Nora had been looking for it on the floor before anyone got to her. That specific 8-year-old response to a fall. Where did my thing go? I called my sister that night. She lives back on Earth, in the city I grew up in. She has 2 kids herself, 7 and 10. I called her and I didn't really tell her what I'd seen. I just said something had happened at work and she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah." And then we talked about her kids for 20 minutes and I went asleep. I don't know why I'm including this in the account. I think it's because everything that followed was so large. The council hearing, the policy discussions, the diplomatic ramifications, the way the incident got woven into the larger narrative of humanity's position in galactic affairs, that I keep wanting to locate the thing that it actually started with. It started with a child on a bench. It started with a snack bar under a fountain. It started with a father who turned around at the right moment and had exactly the right 17 years of service and exactly the right legal knowledge and exactly the right 20 seconds of cold, focused, absolutely controlled response. Section XIV, end of Part 1. 9 days after the incident at Meridian 7, Veth Caron stood before the Galactic Council emergency panel on Galactic Council Station Vareth. He'd brought a legal team. He'd brought a delegation of 6 senior Velthari diplomatic representatives. He'd brought a formal statement prepared by the Velthari High Warlord Council that characterized the incident as incidental contact in a congested transit environment and suggested that the Terran complaint was being used as a political maneuver. He was not expecting what the room contained when he walked in. That's Part 2. But before we get there, I want to say one more thing about the 9 days in between, because something happened during those 9 days that wasn't in any of the official records, and I only know about it because one of the Aldrani checkpoint officers told me. On the morning after the incident, before the footage had been released, before the council had acknowledged the complaint, before any of the diplomatic machinery had started to move, Marcus Reed went back to the fountain in the main concourse of Meridian 7. He was carrying 2 snack bars. He sat down on the bench, the original bench, the tall one, and he put 1 snack bar on the seat next to him, just placed it there. Then he sat there for about 15 minutes, drinking coffee out of a thermal container, looking at the fountain. Then he got up and left. Both snack bars he took with him. The checkpoint officer who told me this said she didn't know what it meant. She said maybe it was something humans do, some kind of ritual. I don't know what it meant either. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. Nobody expected the room to be full. Not full like well-attended, full like standing observers in the back, overflow viewing in the secondary chambers, species who had never once formally requested observer status at a Protocol 7 hearing, suddenly filing the paperwork before the deadline closed. The Galactic Council emergency panel hearing chambers on Vareth Station hold, in standard configuration, 400 observers. There are 3 tiers of seating arranged in a semicircle around the central floor, where the parties to the dispute stand at their respective podiums, and then the panel itself, 7 members, 1 per rotating species chair, on an elevated dais that keeps them physically higher than everyone else, which is apparently important for approximately 4 of the 7 species, and irrelevant to the other 3, but nobody wanted to design 2 different dais configurations, so they kept the one that works. The day of the Veth Caron hearing, all 400 observer seats were filled. In addition to the standard observers, 14 species had formal delegations. The secondary viewing chambers were at capacity. The Council's public transmission network, which normally broadcasts panel hearings to a limited subscriber audience of policy analysts and interspecies legal scholars, had, for the first time in the Council's recorded history, been granted emergency transmission expansion to allow general access. Because of 1 piece of footage. Because of 1 child on a bench. Because of 1 man in a gray travel jacket who had 17 years of service and exactly the right legal knowledge and the cold, absolute discipline to log a formal notification before he said a single word to the entity that had knocked his daughter to the floor. Veth Caron walked into this room. And whatever he'd been told to expect, it wasn't this. Section II, the panel. The emergency panel on the day of the hearing was chaired by High Mediator Silene Arath, an Aldrani woman who had been in galactic jurisprudence for 40 years and who was, by every account I've encountered, precisely as formidable as 40 years in that field produces. Silene Arath is not dramatic. This is the first thing people say about her who have watched her work. She doesn't perform. She speaks clearly, she asks precise questions, and she has a particular quality that I think you either develop or you don't, which is the ability to make silence feel like a weight. When Silene Areth is quiet and looking at you, the quiet has density. The other panel members that day included representatives of the Vast Judiciary, the Korathi Interspecies Authority, and 4 other species whose names I'll include in the formal record but won't attempt to phonetically navigate here. They were all, by the time the hearing opened, fully read in on the incident record. They had all seen the footage. The human representative on the Galactic Council, Ambassador Sephirin Hale, career diplomat, 23 years of service, absolutely unreadable face, was seated in the species delegation section. Not on the panel. Earth seat was in standard rotation, and August wasn't a panel month. But Hale was present in the room in the front row of the human delegation. Marcus Reed was there too. He was not in uniform. There'd been some internal discussion, apparently, about whether he should attend in uniform, and Reed had made the call himself. Civilian clothes. The same kind of outfit as before, essentially dark jacket, plain shirt. He was sitting in the human delegation section, 2 seats from Ambassador Hale. Nora was not there. She and her mother, who had arrived at Meridian 2 days after the incident on the first available transport, were on a passenger vessel somewhere between the outer Kessel Band and Earth. Reed was in the chamber alone, as a representative of a complaint he'd filed. He'd been offered legal counsel and had declined, on the grounds that he was formally acting in his capacity as a TUDF officer invoking an official protocol, not as a private litigant. That distinction mattered. Section III. The opening. High Mediator Areth called the session to order at 900 Vareth Standard Time. She ran through the procedural opening in a way that was brisk without being dismissive. The case number, the protocol, the nature of the complaint, the parties present, the rights of the observer delegations to maintain recorded documentation of the proceedings. This took approximately 8 minutes. Then she addressed the room. This is as close as I can get to a verbatim transcription from the public record, and I want to note that the translation from the Aldrani-inflected standard she was speaking is slightly compressed in the official documents, so this is my best synthesis. This panel is convened under Protocol 7 of the Council Emergency Charter. The complaint before us involves a verified incident occurring in neutral jurisdictional space, Meridian 7 Transit Station, registered joint territory under the Merchant Alliance Compact, in which an individual of Velthari origin, identified as Sub-Warlord Vethkaron, is recorded as having made physical contact with a non-combatant child of Terran origin, resulting in that child's fall and documented minor injury. In a manner that the complaint characterizes as deliberate and without provocation, the Terran complainant, Commander Marcus Reed, filed this notification under Protocol 7 with appropriate standing and within statutory time requirements. The matter is therefore properly before this panel. She looked at the Velthari delegation table. She said, Sub-Warlord Caron, the panel acknowledges your presence. And then she did something that nobody in that room had fully anticipated. She played the footage. Not as part of a formal presentation, not at a scheduled evidentiary moment. She played it at the start of the session, before either party had spoken, on the chamber's full projection system, which puts the image at approximately life scale on a curved surface that wraps around the panel dais. The chamber was silent. 400 observers, 14 species delegations, the panel, both parties silent, watching Nora sit on the bench by the fountain, watching her feet that didn't quite reach the floor, watching the Velthari delegation enter the frame, watching Vethkaron's secondary arm, watching her fall. The sound in the recording was ambient, not narrated. You could hear the station noise. You could hear, very faintly, the sound of the snack bar skittering across the tile. You could hear Nora cry. And then the footage ended and Silene Arath said, without any particular emphasis, "That is what this panel is here to discuss." Section IV, the defense. The Velthari legal representative was a senior figure named Garen Vogt, who had apparently handled council proceedings before, and who opened his statement with what I can only describe as controlled confidence. He argued several things. First, the contact was incidental. The corridor was, at the time of the incident, a transited space, and movement through a transited space naturally involves the possibility of contact with other beings present in that space. The sub-warlord's delegation was moving through an area that a non-registered individual happened to be occupying. Second, the Velthari protocol for interspecies contact in neutral space does not recognize a duty of care toward unregistered individuals in transit areas. Nora was not on the diplomatic route. She was in a general public space. There was no reasonable obligation under Velthari legal framework to modify movement patterns for individuals who had not formally registered as requiring accommodation. Third, the consequences, minor injury, emotional distress, were disproportionate to the nature of the contact, and the fact that a small species child sustained injury from a movement that would not have injured a Velthari individual speaks to an inherent physical disparity that cannot reasonably be called negligence. I am paraphrasing, but those were the three core arguments. Garen Vogt was composed, well-prepared, and spoke for about 22 minutes. When he finished, Silene Arath looked at him for a moment in that weighted silence she uses. She said, "You've argued that the sub-warlord had no obligation to modify his movement pattern for a child in a public space." Garen Vogt agreed, "Correct." Silene Arath said, "And that the contact was consistent with normal transit movement." Garen Vogt agreed again. Silene Arath said, "Panel will recess for 15 minutes.